BBC4.
My name is Adam Nicolson. I'm a writer, and ever since I was a teenager, I have been gripped by the 17th century. It was Britain's most revolutionary century, when all the forces of modernity began to stir under the old order, slugging it out on the great battlegrounds of religion and politics. 2 civil wars, 1 king almost blown up, another with his head cut off, a third simply got rid of. But more important than any of that was the factor which drove the revolutionary changes in this first truly modern century: writing. Writing was everywhere. Notebooks, chapbooks, account books, business correspondence, letters, diaries, pamphlets, newspapers. This was the century of the written word. It was the first great age of self-depiction. All kinds of people were learning to read and write, and through their writings we can know them like never before in history. A woman sent to prison for her conscience. A sailor who wanted to share his adventures. A solitary genius who used his notebooks to unlock the secrets of the universe. Reading and writing allowed people to question what they'd been told, to engage in fierce debate, and to rewrite the rules of politics and self-expression. This was the beginning of the age we now live in, the moment we left the Middle Ages behind and set out on the track to modernity. And that transformation is what fascinates me about the 17th century. In this programme, I'm going to explore the great 17th century revolution in our attitudes to the universe and our place within it. This is when science and religion begin to take their modern form. Before 1600, only a tiny number of people in England had accepted the idea that the Earth orbited the Sun. Most were stuck in a mind world that hadn't developed since antiquity, but that was all about to change. The new literate century was different from what came before, because it was essentially curious. It wanted to find out and then write its discoveries down. What were we made of? What was the world made of? How did the stars work? How did God work? How did the 17th century think? And how did it use writing to do its thinking? What part did writing play in the greatest intellectual revolution there has ever been? The giant shift from the pre-modern to the scientific frame of mind. By the first half of the 1600s, medieval Christianity, where people had lived unquestioningly in the embrace of a deeply hierarchical church, was long gone. The Reformation 50 or 60 years earlier had changed all that. Zealous Protestants were now suspicious of the idea of bishops and priests, of even making the sign of the cross, of baptisms, or even kneeling in church. The Reformation had left the individual naked before God, and although his purpose was revealed in the words of the Bible, he was everywhere around them too. And for those Puritans anxiously writing in their diaries, God was the great headmaster, equipped with a terrifyingly all-seeing eye. God is watching, and there is no escape from his unforgiving gaze.
The committed Puritan began to describe in painful detail his every thought and deed. His diary was the only place where, in seclusion from the world, but in the full presence of God, sin could be washed away. The first character in this journey across the 17th century, from a passive acceptance of God's will to an active scientific investigation of the world, is the classic Puritan, someone who wrote down every minute particular of his agonized life, a man standing for years at a time in the court of God's judgment.
Ralph Jocelyn was a clergyman and farmer from Earl's Colne in Essex. But more important than that, he was a Puritan and a diarist. And his diary, which covers his life from his birth in 1617 to the last harvest before his death in 1683, is the account of a particularly anxious, passionate and questioning man's inner life. But a man who was living in such a God-soaked universe that his reality scarcely meshes with ours. By his own account, Ralph Jocelyn seems to be a voice from a pre-modern world.
But why did he write his diary, nearly 1/3 words, so consistently, so voluminously? How was his vision of himself, his God and his life bound up with the act of writing? Was writing the diary somehow the holiest thing he could do, the place in which he struggled to encounter the truths of existence? Was this 17th century itch to write down your life, at least in his case, an attempt to still the often devastating turbulence of everyday life? In Ralph Jocelyn's world, God was everywhere. Nothing that happened to him or his family, no sign in the weather or in the animals he kept, no thought that went through his head, no piece of good fortune or bad luck, did not seem to him to be part of God's detailed design for the world.
As well as looking after his church, Jocelyn was a very good and careful farmer, spending his life building up his stock, establishing a real estate in the world. And the diary he wrote is really an attempt to reconcile his idea of a good and loving God with his own life, which was one of real pain and suffering.
When the dew fell, it was a sign of God's mercy. When they had plenty of fuel in the woodshed, this was because the Lord was good to us in our health and peace, providing warm house wood firing in the cold beyond any former years. In a world with no insurance policies, he looked everywhere for signs that this was a goodness-providing cosmos. Leaping over the pails, I scratched my face, but God be praised, I had no further hurt, though I might if Providence had not preserved me. And also in our fall, when my wife and I, pulling down a tree with a rope, with our pulling all fell together, but no hurt, God be praised. Such falls, my children, have many times, and yet safe.
Mary fell out of the parlour window with her face against the bench and had no hurt. A strange providence. All the wit of the world could not have given such a fall and preserved from hurt. To God be the praise.
Jocelyn had learned to read and write at school as a boy. He began his diary when he was 27, giving a summary of his life up until that moment, and then going on day by day for decades to come. He called it a thankful observation of divine providence and goodness towards me, and a summary view of my life.
He never writes about sex except once, incredibly obliquely, when he talks about a wantonness in my heart and private converse with my wife. But everything else, his despairs, his hopes, his ambitions, his regrets, his moments of self-congratulation, of self-loathing, his friends, his family, his neighbours, his animals, his lands, his house and all the other buildings, his money, all of it finds a place in one of the most private documents to have survived from the 17th century. And all of it written in this tiny, exceptionally private handwriting. There's no sense of this being a performance or an advertisement. This is a man alone with himself and with his creator, the God who he refers to at one point as my dear angry Lord.
Jocelyn's diary, with its intense transcribing of daily life, is almost like an account book of the soul.
Why did he have to write all this down? Why could he simply not experience the difficulties of living in a God-dominated world like this? What is it about actual writing?
Well, I think the writing is about forgetting and an anxiety about forgetting. He's desperate to remember and therefore log every tiny little sin or indiscretion in order to come back to it and to interpret it.
But why? Why do you need to remember those details?
Well, because those details, those very, very minute, apparently minute, trivial details, are the markers, the signs of God's presence in your life. It's all the Puritans had, or it's one of the sources that the Puritans had for making sense of God's presence in their life. And if Puritans are constantly trying to discern whether they're elect or not, whether they're destined for heaven or not, they can't, like Catholics, rely on good works and move towards salvation in that way. They have to, as it were, sit back and read what happens to them in a rather more passive way. And
so there's no such thing as luck or chance in a Puritan's life. Everything is significant.
Everything is significant, from standing in a puddle of water to falling off your horse to that magnificent moment in the diary where he gets stung on the nose by a bee, covers it with honey and is very delighted that that seems to have done the trick in terms of the sting. But also he notes the moral of that, which for him is that the Lord intervenes in the most apparently trivial, minute ways in his life.
Do you think you can say that in the 17th century something happened to the culture which made people write diaries?
Protestantism and Puritanism is one great catalyst. The events of the mid-17th century, the Civil War, and the sense of the world not being the way that you always thought it might be, also prompted people to think about their place in that world in a new order.
What do you mean by that? Do you mean that the actual social change meant that people had to think of themselves in different ways?
Yeah, if suddenly the monarchy, which seems like an entirely natural, inevitable, God-given construct, is suddenly abolished, that must, on a very profound level, I think, shake your sense of your world and your community and how you fit into that world. And also, this is a period in which print publication explodes. There are masses and masses of printed books and lots of short printed books on an unprecedented scale. And people were reading more, literacy rates were rising. Jocelyn is reading all the time, we know that from the diary. And if you're reading books, which are often books about people's lives, that's providing you with new models for thinking about your own life.
For Jocelyn, it was a precarious world, full of unknowns, with inadequate medicine and lives lived in consistent danger, at home, at work and on the farm. A bullock died almost suddenly. Lord, there is nothing sure but thyself. People fell off their horses so often, it was as if the entire population were riding dodgy motorbikes. Your average English family suffered on a daily and weekly basis in ways few of us now could comprehend.
If things went wrong, and they did, that could only be because Jocelyn had done something wrong. As far as he was concerned, God's punishment was a sign of God's love.
Jocelyn's diary gives a powerful sense of a life lived under siege. It's a constant, almost obsessional discussion of pain, sickness, and death. Most of us now only bury our parents and grandparents. In the 17th century, a man my age, in his mid-50s, would, on average, have buried 1 in 3 of his children, 1 in 2 of his own adult siblings, and probably his wife. It was more usual then to bury someone younger than someone older than you. Rafe Jocelyn was no exception.
His whole life was surrounded by death. Before he was 10, his mother died, 2 of his sisters, his father died in his teens, then his grandfather and grandmother. In his 20s, his father-in-law, followed by an uncle, a cousin, another uncle, an aunt. In his 30s, a great-uncle, a son, another son, and a daughter. Nothing in our lives is comparable to this experience. In his 30s, it went on. His mother-in-law, 2 cousins, an uncle, another aunt. Death was more present in 17th century England than anywhere on earth today. The figure's far worse than for modern Afghanistan or even the poorest country in sub-Saharan Africa.
Jocelyn struggled with these often devastating realities. How could a good God allow such suffering? What had he done personally to deserve it? Could affliction be a sign of divine love? Is never clearer than in his terrible detailed accounts of the lingering deaths of his children.
In February 1648, Jane gave birth to their second son, a little Rafe. But from the beginning, he was going downhill, and his father always refers to him in his diary as it, perhaps as a way of keeping any possible grief at bay. My wife persuaded herself it would die. It was a very sick child indeed. I took my leave of it at night, not much expecting to see it alive. But God continued it to morning, and it seemed to me not hopeless. But it's thine, Lord. I hand it to thy disposing. Only I pray thee, give me and my wife a submitting heart. A submitting heart, the instruction of a pious man to himself, not to question divine wisdom, but to accept it.
Rafe is not so tedious to us because he doth not shriek or cry in his fits, but lieth quietly. We gave him breast milk at last, and little else. On February the 21st, Jocelyn wrote these words.
This day my dear babe Rafe quietly fell asleep and is at rest with the Lord. O Lord, spare the rest of us that are living, for thy name's sake we entreat thee. We looked on it as a dying child 3 or 4 days. It died quietly, without shrieks or sobs or sad groans. It breathed out the soul with 9 gasps and died. The Lord learn me wisdom and to know his mind in this chastisement.
In the days that followed, he chewed over the agony of his predicament. What had he done to deserve this? Could God not reveal his purposes?
And when I had seriously considered my heart and ways, and compared them with the affliction, and sought unto God, my thoughts often fixed on these particulars. Whereas I have given my mind to unseasonable playing at chess, now it run in my thoughts in my illness, as if I had been at chess. I shall be very sparing in the use of that recreation. So that is the reason this Puritan minister gave for the death of his son. It wasn't that he was playing at chess, or he'd been playing at chess on a Sunday, but that when he was ill, he had been thinking of playing at chess. That is why Rafe was dead, and that is why the rod of chastisement had fallen.
Jocelyn and people like him lived in an angry and unforgiving universe, full of argument, rage and punishment. In effect, he suffered the world, virtually impotent in front of it. But there were many in the 17th century who wanted to substitute the disputatious Christianity that filled Jocelyn's diary with curious investigation, a rational attempt to make sense of the world. The founding of the Royal Society in London in 1660 is often seen as marking the birth of science in this country. But in fact, that gathering of learned gents grew out of a world of proto-scientists and investigators who had been examining, experimenting with, and writing down what they found in the natural world for many decades.
At the end of the 16th century, what was most people's attitude to nature and the material world? How did they approach it?
Well, I guess most people had a very literal understanding of the Bible, and so what was written in the Bible was how they understood the natural world, coupled, of course, with what they saw around them. But it was very much dependent on authority.
What is the change that happened then during the century?
Francis Bacon, I guess, is the key figure there. He was a philosopher, an English philosopher, writing at the very beginning of the 17th century. And it was really his ideas about experiment that sparked what we call the scientific revolution. Bacon was suggesting that we could conduct experiments to find out about the natural world, and that meant thinking of an idea and then going out and testing it. So he was very keen on collecting a lot of information about all aspects of the natural world.
And what was he after in that? What was the point of this new method?
Well, I guess it was the sense that there was more to be discovered about the world than people knew at the time.
It's easy to think that science is an enemy of religion, but that isn't really true of this period, is it?
No, it's certainly not true for this period. And in fact, a lot of the people who were doing what we think of as science were in fact very devout Christians. Many of them were trained as clergymen as well. So, for example, someone like Robert Boyle spent his whole time talking about how science would support Christian ideas, that there was probably a limit to how much men could understand about the world, and that beyond that limit was God.
God, the great designer.
Exactly. So this is a copy of Robert Hooke's Micrographia, which we've got out of the Royal Society's library here. On this page you can see his microscope. He made some improvements on the microscope himself. So this is the first illustrated book of microscopy. And I'll just show you the first image here. It shows the point of a needle,
Really?
a printed full stop, and the edge of a razor. And he's chosen those things because to the human eye they look perfect, but through the microscope you can see that they're imperfect. And his point, I think, was that man-made objects, the more you looked at them, the less perfect they became. But the natural objects that he looks at in the rest of the book, the closer you look at them, the more beautiful and the more perfect they become.
And there is his flea. I absolutely love that. What a magnificent thing, isn't it?
Exactly, it is magnificent, and if you can imagine seeing it for the first time, it's just opening up a whole new world for people as well, and I think that's what the microscope and the telescope, which were the two sort of key instruments of the period, did. You know, they showed people that there was a new world to be seen.
In the rising swell of 17th century curiosity, the urge to question inherited wisdom, to look at the world and note down all its oddities and rarities, there was one man who stood out among his contemporaries, His name was Sir Thomas Browne.
Thomas Browne, a Norwich doctor, knighted late in life by Charles II, was a member of a new generation inspired by the works of Francis Bacon, who began to look at the world in a different way from the Jocelins. They were going to test it, not relying on the inherited wisdom of the ancients, but using their eyes to experiment and investigate, teasing out the truth with the instruments of likelihood and logic. They were going to write the world down in a new way.
Browne was completely entranced by the world in which he was lucky enough to find himself alive. Everything written and everything on which he chanced, every creature and plant of sea, river and air, all came under his voraciously examining eye. And in the human being, the two most valuable qualities were the ability to encounter the world as it was and then to apply reason to it.
As he wrote in his notebook, those were the two great pillars of truth, experience and solid reason. Restless curiosity was his watchword, an unending sequence of inquiries into the real world, gathering its materials around him like a curator of reality.
Throughout his life, he jotted down his thoughts and observations in notebooks. Nature was there to be read. God had written in nature the meaning of the universe in shorthand, like a secretary. So much was opaque in the world, but those who had eyes to see could see.
For Browne, the meaning of the universe was apparent in nature if you looked for it. And as he wrote in his notes, not in capital letters, yet in stenography, in shorthand, which, to wiser reason, seem as luminaries in the abyss. If you looked hard enough at nature, you could see what it meant.
After studying medicine in Europe, Browne returned to England in the early 1630s, still not 30 years old, and set up as a doctor. He would marry a Norfolk girl, Dorothy Milam, in 1641, and have 11 children with her, 6 of them surviving to adulthood. But happy as they were, the focus of Browne's life wasn't domestic bliss.
It was much more the wonders of the world around him. He and Mrs. Browne lived in a house that was full of dazzling possibilities. And when John Evelyn, the diarist, came to visit them in 1671, he described their house and garden being a paradise and cabinet of rarities, especially medals, books, plants, natural things, a collection of eggs of all the fowls and birds he could procure, as cranes, storks, eagles, etc., and a variety of waterfowl. Basically, anything Thomas Browne could get his hands on.
Browne was intrigued by nature's detail. For him, its minutiae were its most compelling ingredients. He wrote, "Ruder heads stand amazed at those prodigious pieces of nature, whales, elephants, dromedaries and camels. These, I confess, are the colossus and majestic pieces of her hand. But in these narrow engines there is more curious mathematics, and the civility of these little citizens more neatly set forth the wisdom of their maker."
Browne's house was absolutely stuffed with all the odds and ends that he'd collected, and his working papers are, in a way, the written equivalent to that. Open-ended, nearly chaotic, but driven by an endless curiosity about the natural world.
His note-taking may have been fragmentary or anarchic, but he became one of the century's great writers. He published many books, which earned him a reputation throughout Europe.
the enterprise of 17th century science is very often deliberately fragmentary in its sensibility. It knows that it's never going to produce a system or a treatise. It's only going to be able to fill in the odd bit of the jigsaw. And I think that Brown's writing very much illustrates that he'll say all that it's possible to say, but no more. He will occasionally speculate about scientific conclusions, but not very often.
But when you look at his handwriting in those notes, it's so fluent, it's so quick, there's a kind of hunger for the world. It's rapacious, isn't it? It's not meticulous like a modern scientist would be.
If you look at the original notebooks, the ones that are in the order in which he wrote them, they're a complete jumble of stuff. And there'll be one page which will be, a letter to his son about ostriches, and the next page will be about church bells or about echoes or about what you can see from the top of Norwich Cathedral. So it really goes everywhere, and he doesn't organize his knowledge, at least at that level.
It's not that he's actually living in anarchy.
I think there's a certain anarchy of observation, and I think that's part of the deal. That's what you're doing as a 17th century scientist. Nobody said you can't work on that because it's not quite botany and you're working on botany. If something interests you because it reminds you of botany, you will go and look at it.
And doesn't that feel so much more exciting and alive than later cut and dried science, which is so shut within little, cabined, confined areas like that? This is a great roaming mind.
He's a very untrammeled writer, and that's probably what makes him good. There's no structure that he's bound to observe, and so his works probably evolve in ways that are slightly different from everybody else's because he's unshackled in that way.
Can you tell what sort of man he was from his writing?
I think you get a very strong sense of Brown as first of all, quite modest, but also somebody who is sure of the things that he's sure of. So I think that the sense that you get of him is a highly, highly intelligent, highly learned man who wears his learning very lightly.
And you love him?
I love him. I want to be him.
I think you are him. As the new world he was discovering was largely uncharted, he even found he needed new language to describe and communicate his observations.
He was an incredibly inventive maker of new words, dragging them into English from Latin and Greek, and adding to the word pile used by other 17th century writers. Over 100 of the words now in the Oxford Dictionary were used by him for the first time. Antediluvian, approximate, aquiline, analogous, bisect, carnivorous, coexistence, coma, cryptography, compensate, computer, cylindrical, disruption, electricity, exhaustion, follicle, generator, gymnastics, hallucination, herbaceous, insecurity, jocularity, literary, locomotion, medical, mucus, prostate, protuberant, polarity, precocious, pubescent, suicide, ulterior, and ultimate. He was a word-making machine.
This life of curiosity and invention found its most popular outlet in his bestseller, Pseudodoxia Epidemica, or Vulgar Errors, first published in 1646, but reprinted many times. It was that classic 17th century thing, an encyclopedia of wrong ideas.
People had always said that badgers were lopsided so that they could run along hillsides better. But were they? Clearly not. It was always said that toads and spiders hated each other. But was that true? Well, Brown had to do an experiment. He put a toad in a jar with several spiders and watched what happened. This is what he wrote in his notebook. Having in a glass included a toad with several spiders, we beheld the spiders without resistance to sit upon his head and pass over all his body. So obviously the spiders didn't hate the toad.
But what, at last, the toad upon advantage, he swallowed down. Toads clearly ate spiders, and that in a few hours unto the number of 7. So toads didn't hate spiders, they had them for lunch. Perhaps the oddest of all Brown's encounters with the natural world came when he somehow got hold of an ostrich to study. The specimen which arrived in his Norwich garden stood over 7 feet tall.
It soon ate up all the gillyflowers and the tulip leaves and everything that was green, lettuce, endive, sorrel. It would feed on oats and barley, that's what we've got in this bucket here. But he spent hours observing these really strange creatures. And by observing their strangeness, almost brought them within the compass of the knowledge which everyone could share. What do you think?
Brown had a particular fascination with what the ostrich would eat.
He managed to persuade his ostrich to eat an onion and watch the onion descending spiral-wise down the strange gullet of the ostrich. He tried to make her drink a pint of beer. Have some beer. And I think with not much success. Olives and also iron wrapped in pastry, which is one of these old myths that ostriches liked eating iron because that's the only reason their feathers were so large. And needless to say, his ostrich only ate the pastry and left the iron behind. So this was another truth proved by experiment. And that was something that went into the next edition of Pseudodoxia Epidemica. Some of the ignorance of the past dispersed, and some of the light of knowledge brought into the world of the ostrich.
Sir Thomas Browne was friends with many others who were feeling their way into this new understanding of nature. But for all that, and perhaps because he was busy with his practice as a Norwich doctor, he was essentially working alone. But Browne had a contemporary whose life was dedicated to making connections between the investigating minds around him. His name was Samuel Hartlib. Samuel Hartlib, part German, part English, lived here in London, in a house probably a little poorer than this one, in Duke's Place, hopelessly improvident and living hand to mouth with his virtually destitute family. For him, the written word was all. Letter writing, information gathering, spreading knowledge, not for personal gain. In fact, he largely bankrupted himself with his various schemes, but because he believed that a good society depended on what he called correspondency, linkages, networks, the most fruitful exchange of information that could be devised. He grasped the key fact of the century, that communication lay at the heart of the new civilization. To a good Puritan like Hartlib, this burgeoning world of knowledge was to be seen as part of God's purpose, a sign that England, particularly in the 1650s, as Cromwell's new government began to rid the country of its old royalist ways, was on the brink of a new heaven and a new earth. It was time for a communications revolution and a moment of great optimism. Hartlib himself wrote, "Instead of fear, a great door of hope is open to us, that we shall be firmly and fully settled in all abundance of peace and truth." He would gather knowledge and spread it through letters and printed books. He would be a kind of knowledge fountain, improving lives in all kinds of practical ways, in winemaking, in farming, in gardening, even in scent distilling, an idea he got from Italy. He had lots of new inventions too, a whole scheme for a new kind of ink which could make multiple copies from a single written sheet. Another idea, an actual multi-copy writing machine attached to the pen of a single scribe, generating other sheets as he wrote. even a new kind of seed dressing, which he called a philosophical dung, that would create huge and unheard of, miraculous yields. Hartlib was going to change the world. He became the great intelligencer of Europe, working alongside teams of scribes and scholars, writing to anyone who might have information to offer him, all across England and Ireland, from Transylvania to Germany, Virginia and the Caribbean. He felt that communication would make man happy. As he wrote in 1651, "It is nothing but the narrowness of our spirits makes us miserable." The classic product of the Hartlib Knowledge Factory was a book called The Reformed Commonwealth of Bees. Published in London in 1655, it was a compendium of all kinds of knowledge and expertise on the keeping of bees.
For Hartlib, it was the perfect subject for his method. You can see that a 17th century man looking at this perfect organisation would think of it as a model of the way people could be. He could get all kinds of information from across England, Europe, even the other side of the Atlantic, and bring it all together for the common good.
This was writing by the people, for the people.
It's a chaotic ragbag of a book, but that's partly the point. Hartlib didn't believe in singular authority. Everybody, every bee, should and could be able to contribute.
Mr. Carew in Cornwall recommended burying a dead calf and then exhuming it and collecting the bees that gathered in the rotting corpse. A Dr. Brown was adamant that if you had his newly invented multi-story beehive, you didn't have to kill your bees to collect your honey. If you followed this instruction, the bees would live happy in their own little commonwealth. Your bees shall always be provided of a sweet dwelling, large enough for themselves and their increase, and whereby they shall easily be kept together. In all probability, by God's blessing and your own moderate care, you shall have multitudes of bees, and consequently abundance of honey.
The contributors to the new Commonwealth of Bees were driven by a new kind of idealistic thinking. If men could use their senses to get a true grasp of nature, and their reason to understand how the world works, and revelation in the words of the Bible to interpret God's will, there was a good chance of making a good society here in England. And the way to do that? To tell each other, to spread the word.
To help build this utopian commonwealth of happy, well-informed citizens, Hartlib hatched an ambitious plan. Parliament had triumphed in the Civil War, imprisoning and then executing King Charles I in 1649, establishing the only republican government this country has ever known. Hartlib felt the time was right to set up one of the most extraordinary schemes in 17th century England, an office of address. It was to be a combination of employment agency, counselling centre, commodities exchange, marriage bureau, patent office, public library, and a living, ever-revisable encyclopedia. Connection was all. He wanted a centre and meeting place of advices, of proposals, of treaties, and of all manner of intellectual rarities, freely to be given and received to and from, by and for, all such as may think themselves concerned. Just like the Royal Exchange, where English merchants had derived huge material benefit from being able to trade whatever anyone needed or wanted, Hartlib's office of address was going to give England exactly what it needed: info.
You could go there and you could have any question that you liked answered. This was his idea. It's like Google. That's like a search engine, in a way.
Brilliant idea, isn't it? It's kind of crazy.
It is absolutely going to.
Well, you know, beautifully idealistic, you could say.
Well, Hartlib was devoted to, if I can put it bluntly, creating a kind of paradise on earth. He believed that before the Last Judgment would take place, that a universal reformation had to occur, in which humankind could be lifted from its baser instincts to a more sublime level. And that's why it was important, at least Hartlib felt that it was important, that all his energies should be put into pursuing this universal reformation.
He's not unique in that. All the great 17th century scientists, if you can call them that, are people who are deeply involved with the idea that this is God's world, and that real human understanding of the world is a route to a sort of godly world.
I think it becomes, however, more latent with these figures, and as the century wears on, you know, as experimental science rises, there seems to be more of a separation between the two aspects. Of course, you could be, and you probably would be, deeply interested in millenarian ideas or apocalyptic ideas if you were a natural philosopher in the 17th century. But for Hartlib, this was the defining blueprint towards which all projects had their end and all innovations had their end. And I think that's what separates him.
How essential was the written word to his life?
It was absolutely essential. He did a lot of writing. He spent, in one letter, he mentioned spending, you know, more than his yearly salary on costs of letters for corresponding with people.
So his whole life and project is inconceivable without writing, without, in fact, the level of literacy that was around in the mid-17th century.
Absolutely, absolutely. For him, it was about communicating information, initially within his networks, but ultimately for communicating it to the public at large.
Do you think he was just very naive?
Yeah, he's almost a tragic figure. That's how I kind of see him in a way. He was thwarted at every turn, almost in England, by changes of governments and by things, frankly, beyond his control. And I think his persistence really makes him a lovable figure.
But for all his zeal and determination, Hartlib's big idea was doomed.
One pilot office was set up in Threadneedle Street in London, but on the whole, Hartlib's scheme for a universal information service failed to take off. And this was because of the completely chaotic conditions in Cromwellian London. Different factions of the parliamentary party at each other's throat, footpads on the roads making travel dangerous, demobbed soldiers clamouring for all the food and money they'd never been given. A total breakdown of local justice. It just wasn't the situation to set up a network of sweet, communal, idealistic information centres.
After the collapse of the Cromwellian Commonwealth and the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the idealism of that republican moment gave way to the place-seeking and corruption of the Restoration Court. Samuel Hartlib's time was up.
After 1660, his whole world fell apart. All his connections with the Cromwellian regime really meant he was yesterday's story. The royalists weren't interested in him. His eyes were troubling him, his kidneys were hell, he was drinking sulfuric acid to try and cure the kidney stones. In the end, they killed him. But the only thing left, his great monument, was his mound of correspondence. The final figure in this cavalcade of 17th century idealists and dreamers is a deeply isolated man who was intent on discovering nothing less than the structure of the universe, who poured over 4 million words into some of the most precious notebooks to have survived in this country, the jottings and revelations of the century's greatest man. This wasn't going to be a cabinet of curiosities, a collection of oddities and rarities in the manner of Thomas Browne, nor a blind Jocelyn-style wandering about the mind of God. but an attempt to understand the underlying principles of the universe. This notebook was an agenda for revolution.
Newton was exchanging the world of inherited wisdom for observation and measurement.
He wrote down 45 headings under which he was going to arrange the truths he was setting out to discover. The nature of matter and time and place and motion, the cosmic order, rarity, fluidity, softness, violent motion, light, colours, vision, sensation. Every statement in these pages is an implicit experiment, and the notebook was the key instrument. Only there would experiments be described, theories tested, hypotheses proved. The notebook is where Newton's life was going to come to fruition.
And it was here in 1666 at his yeoman farmer family home at Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, on the run from the plague in Cambridge, that he conducted his most famous optics and light experiments. For Newton, it was vitally important first to know how he saw what he saw. And so, armed with his trusty notebook, he started to explore his own vision.
He was incredibly reckless with his experiments. He took a bodkin, a kind of blunt darning needle, and as he wrote about it in his notebook, put it betwixt my eye and the bone, as near to the backside of my eye as I could, and pressing my eye with the end of it, that is, with the bodkin inside the eye, there appeared several white, dark and coloured circles, and his drawing here shows this great lump of a steel thing shoved into the eye, and then these concentric circles that this distortion of the eyeball made him see. How he didn't go blind, I just don't know.
But the thing he wanted to prove most was his intuition about the nature of light itself.
So this is the great experiment room, Newton's light laboratory. Before Newton, they thought that white light was the real thing.
Yes,
The light
exactly
was
right.
essentially white.
Yes, people thought that white light was pure, homogeneous and God-given, and that it was being somehow mixed up, it was being dyed or coloured.
So this is a page from Newton's own notebook that he kept at the time, experiments with the prism. And number 7, taking a prism into a dark room, which we do indeed have here, into which the sun shone only at one little round hole, and laying it close to the hole in such a manner that the rays, being equally refracted, cast colours on the opposite wall.
Oh, now we're illuminating something.
There it is.
We've got the spectrum
There
over
it
there.
is.
That's quite
But
nice.
that is exactly
Yes.
what Newton would have seen.
Yes, pretty well. But then that didn't prove anything, really, because people believed that what the prism was doing was actually colouring the light.
Right.
The critical thing was the next bit, the second part of his experiment.
To test his theory that the prism itself was not somehow adding colours to white light, Newton brought in a second prism.
Okay, now we've got it. What we're doing here is if we can just introduce the prism into the red light, and the red light is just here. You see where my finger's touching it?
Yes.
We've only got red light going into the prism now, so we're getting red light because we're only intercepting red light. So what it's showing is that light is, the colours in the light are of their own nature. They are essentially homogeneous, whereas the white light is heterogeneous or mixed.
And this is the great, this is the experiment he called the crucial experiment.
Yes, this is the crucial experiment, which had never been done by anybody else before.
So it completely changes the way in which people look at light. The
Indeed.
white light is no longer the original regal source from the sun. Because of this, you can know that white light is a muddle of coloured lights.
Exactly.
This is like truth appearing in a dark room in Lincolnshire, isn't it?
Yes, that's very well put.
Yeah,
Yes, I think,
beautiful.
yes.
Always accompanying Newton's experiments were copious notes. Can you read anything of him, of the man, from what you see on this page?
Well, they seem to indicate that he had this phenomenally penetrating desire to understand, and everything he did was to try and penetrate more deeply into his subject. He had an intellect which was almost vicious. Once he got hold of a problem, he would concentrate on it to such an extent that in the end it would yield to him. It really reflects the intensity of his intellect. He said of himself that he didn't look upon himself as having genius, but what he could do was concentrate. And it's the concentration that you see in everything he ever did, particularly in his writing. And it's difficult to see how one person writing, let's say, 24 hours a day could produce this vast amount of written work.
But it doesn't seem to be anything that wants to communicate with anyone else. This is him talking to himself.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. When you look, for instance, with the problem with colour, he found that when he did try and communicate, people were so opposed to his ideas that he said he would give up trying to publish and he would just get on and find out for himself. One of the major things that he was interested in was finding out where God intervened. He was obsessed about trying to find out exactly what part God was playing in the physical universe.
So the notebook is really a kind of correspondence between him and truth, or him and
his God.
Yes.
I think that I don't think it was for public consumption until people discovered what he'd done. And then he was essentially flushed out of his study.
Newton had arrived at a kind of reality, and the whole modern history of radiation flows from that moment. And in this notebook, too, Newton's writing had arrived at a new maturity. So the notebook is not just a vessel for observation, but an instrument for understanding. Where Brown used writing to report on the details of the world, an essential Baconian task, and not think about it much beyond that, and Hartlib used writing to promote a good society, Newton used it to think about the nature of the world, and using mathematics to tease out its underlying structure. By 1700, England was beginning to realise that Newton had described with arithmetical precision the workings of the universe. God was no longer a capricious deity who taunted people with his cruelties. His rationality was now evident in a universe that was observable and measurable through telescope and microscope, barometer and thermometer.
The 17th century is such an exciting time, partly for its strangeness, all its muddle of maths and magic, its fierce beliefs and high idealism, its long and intricate struggle to understand the material world, but also because its people are so knowable through what they wrote, their journals, their diaries, their letters, their notebooks. It's the first great age of self-depiction.
In the next programme, I will explore how the literacy revolution of the 17th century spread its energies and ambitions out across the Atlantic Ocean, allowing people to experience an expanding world.
And we're heading back in time to Florence next tonight and keeping in there with the all-powerful Medicis, with Stephen Smith as our guide to how to get ahead at Renaissance Court here on BBC4.